Everyone. Yeah, so as you can see from the image there, for those who know, this is Richborough. I've recently colorized some of the old excavation photos. So this is the colorized photos from the 1930s excavation. As you can see right in the background, you have the sea there, which has receded over the years and used to come all the way up to the tree line by the fort. For anyone who isn't familiar, Richborough is on near the east coast of Kent, around apparently near Shaw's Garden Design. And from Reculver down to Richborough used to be the Wonson Channel, which separated Thanet from the mainland. And Richborough was on its own tiny little island in this area, so they had to build some kind of bridge, which we don't know much about, across to mainland Britannia. So in very general terms, chronology, because it's not so much what I'll be talking about today, but it is important. We have recent evidence from carbon dating, C14 dating on some of the skulls from Richborough, that one of them dates to the Late Bronze Age, and there are a couple of Late Bronze Age objects. The excavations also uncovered some Iron Age occupation in the form of several large and small ditches. However, the dating wasn't very close for these. The pottery dates for a long period, but crucially, and like Steve was just saying about Caesar, we don't have Caesar at Richborough that we know of. The Iron Age evidence doesn't seem to go past 75 BC at the very latest. The Roman occupation of the site, which is mostly what I'll be talking about, carries on from the invasion in AD 43, and those in the know, Richborough is supposedly at least one of the landing sites for that invasion, but it's always up for debate, and carries on all the way to what I like to say is 410 plus, because there is good evidence for 5th century occupation. We just don't quite know when that ends. There is a bit of a gap, probably in the 7th century, but then in the early 8th century, we now think that's when the first church was built on the site. And there is possible evidence for Viking raids or Viking occupation at the site in the form of 3 stikers, which are coins from Northumbria, which are very weird in Kent, and 3 on one site is ridiculous. It just doesn't happen. But we know in the AD 850s, they were sighted. The winter army was on the Isle of Thanet. So the coins line up quite nicely with that. Just as a quick overview of the site, the main features, you can see there at the bottom, the Claudian ditches, which stretch for 2,100 feet, so 600 odd meters, and cut off the shoreline. We then have some buildings around the site, which made up part of a port town. However, what I'm about to say will put the cat amongst many, many pigeons, that there is good evidence, firstly, that the Claudian ditches were open for about 20 years rather than 20 weeks, as some might have interpreted, that the town or the first military supply base isn't a supply base, it's more of a port town, which starts in the Flavian period, and that the monumental arch constructed under Domitian was actually more likely constructed under Antoninus Pius. There's quite a lot of dating problems with this site. Once you delve into the archive and don't take the publications as read, it starts to look a little different and makes a lot more sense. But I'll come on to that in a bit. There's also the fortlet here, these triple ditches around the monument after it was demolished, probably of Carausius, and there is good evidence for that as well now. And then there's the fort walls, which were built, again, looking at the archives, there's missed evidence that suggests that they were built under Carausius and Electus in the AD 290s, and that perhaps because of the different construction of this north wall to the rest, it wasn't finished by the end of their reign when they got kicked out. But I'll show the chronology, my new chronology, a bit later. Excavations on the site. The first took place in the 1790s, or late 1700s, under William Boyes, who started to look at some of the site, but didn't find much. 300-year-old excavations weren't of the standard they were today. In the 19th century, there were several excavations, mostly around that monument platform, and it was at one point suggested that it wasn't a monumental arch, but it was for docking ships and pulling them in with ropes, which didn't seem to hold water for very long. But the main excavations were in the 1920s and 1930s by the Society of Antiquaries, and this covered most of the site within the walls here. However, we do know that through geophysics, there's a huge amount of archaeology not yet uncovered in these fields. So realistically, this area only covers about 11% of the known area of archaeology at Richborough. To give you an idea of the difference between the archive and the publications, we've now catalogued 9,000 small finds in the collection, of only which just shy of 1,000 actually were ever published in the original reports. There's over 3,000 pottery sherds, 1,000 fragments of glass vessels, there's window glass, bone, building material, all sorts of other bits and pieces from the site, which have all been, which do require a lot more study, to be honest. So what I really wanted to talk about today is those objects, a lot that were missed and some that were published. The main occupation in the 1st century, or at least a few 20 years or so in the 1st century and in the 4th century, was the Roman military. And a good example of this is here, these fittings from Roman armor from Lorica segmentata. And then it's also very nice and silver inlaid scabbard from a Roman dagger, Pugio, that was found just outside the fort, which, being outside those fort walls and being a 1st century date, suggested that the occupation in the 1st century was a lot wider than where they actually excavated. Again, top and tailing Britain with the military. The brooch here is a Hodge Hill type, named after the famous site, the famous hill fort with the Roman fort in the corner after a supposed battle there. We get loads of these at Richborough, and also the other military Alcissa type brooches as well. There's almost an even number of the pair, and many, many more than most military sites in Britain. But that doesn't mean it was only the first 20 years. It's quite likely, given some of the contextual evidence, that the Roman military had a hand in the port town and possibly dealing with imports and exports managed for the empire. And at the other end of the period, in the 4th century, we have these known military crossbow brooches, or at least official crossbow brooches. They're a sign of Roman officials, Roman military. They're not worn by civilians that we really know of. You see them displayed in imperial reliefs and different images, so we know that was their use. I'll come on to those as well later on with something more other about those. And then one of the other key things, again, top and tailing the periods, is these belt buckles. I picked these two in particular because this first one that still has the buckle tongue is actually Augustan in date. It doesn't mean that there was anyone on the site during the reign of Augustus, but it shows these long-lived objects and something that probably someone who'd been in the military nearly their whole career had worn during the invasion. And at the other end again, we have 4th century buckles which came over from the continent. They were once thought to be more of Germanic origin, but actually they're probably what we now refer to as a late Roman style. There's a mix of cultures that have gone into the development of these, and they arrive and then influence new types found in Britain. And to go along with those late buckles, we have the strap ends. So if you ever notice when you put on your belt, there's obviously the loose end of it that you tuck away in a loop. The Romans had these strap ends on them. And these two, again, I've picked because the first one that looks a bit like an amphora, also known as an amphora type, I'm working on the new typology for these, this has, from what my study has shown, has very continental looking features. The narrower, thinner, without the handles, with these different lunate kind of lugs on, and this sea beast, which could be interpreted as a piece of Christian iconography. this style seems to originate in Western Britain after the arrival of these strap ends from the continent. So you can see there's an influence going on there, and probably the movement of people from west to east as well. But it's not all just men in there, is women and children. Children really only represented on the site by small shoes and by, or interpreted as pottery feeding bottles. Women are a bit more visible on the site. Hairpins are always a huge giveaway. And we have them in loads of different materials: copper alloy, bone. There's a silver one down the bottom here that doesn't look it anymore. And also jet, which I just love being able to put jet in a paper and saying it comes from monkey puzzle trees. It's just the best sentence to say. But as you can see, it cracks quite a lot over time and is very fragile and a friable material to work with. But as you can see, there's also some different imagery used here: hands holding, usually interpreted as pomegranates and apples. Different imperial hairstyles can help us date the pins. This one dating to the late 2nd century. And then we have different types of bracelets. Again, the same sort of materials. We have copper alloy, we have bone, we have jet again. In this case, we have shale, which is a late 4th century phenomena, as are most bracelets on the site. Where we can really identify women occupying the site is in the late 4th century. And this is where, for want of a better phrase, the living quarters of the military change drastically, go out the window. They allow, whether they're allowed or not, women and children are living within the fort and the quarters of the soldiers. Looking back to Luke's paper as well, there's a lot of activity on the site, like leisure activities. There's gaming. We have lots of pieces of marble reused as gaming boards. You can just about see some of the lines carved on here. Usually this is interpreted as marble that's come from the monument after its demolition, and they've made gaming boards out of it. But it could also be that these were offcuts of marble used during the monument's construction that have then been made into to gaming boards. So it might be that these are dated earlier to maybe the 2nd century rather than the late Roman period. And to go along with these, we have a lot of gaming counters. The most common are glass and bone. We do get some very nicely made blue glass counters, especially made probably for gaming. But then some other bits that have probably come from some recycled glass or made from glass vessels and then shaped to form a counter. And like I say, probably the most common material for these is bone. There's lots of different decorations, lots of carvings, lots of graffiti on them, which might suggest different games being played, different purposes for the counters, but no one's really done a big study of these ones just yet. So that's another area ripe for study. It's not all play though. There's plenty of work going on. There is an area of the site from the 1st to 2nd century which produced a lot of old military fittings, as well as a pair of blacksmith's tongs and quite a few whetstones used for sharpening blades. So we could say this is an armory, but what I really interpreted this as a metal workshop that is either making lots of different things like armor, brooches, hairpins, etc. But that also might have been old military stock that's being recycled into other objects. So we can't really say that the site of that metal workshop is specifically an armory. There's woodworking through axes are a common sign of that. But then also on the other side here, we have an auger where on the wider pointed end would have been a piece of wood across the top that you could twist the other end of this into the wood to bore a hole for fitting pieces together or carving, etc. So there's lots of different tools going on there for that. There's clear evidence of metalworking going on. There's lots of these big bags of copper alloy pieces. I think there's about 400 individual pieces in there, but I didn't count them all. And then the other side here, we have a metalworking crucible, which we found several of them on the site. And at some point in the future, would love to do some residue and metal analysis on those to see what was being worked at the time. There's also fabric working. Spindle whorls for spinning yarn is a common sign on the site, but again, this is something where deposits on Hadrian's Wall has suggested that members of the military, the male contingent in the military, is actually spinning as well as women doing it. So again, it's hard to really say what's going on there. And a lot of them were actually found in the late military areas of the site. So it's contentious to who was doing what jobs on the site at the time. But then on the other side, we also have a leather working awl for piercing holes in leather to stitch together. So there's lots of different jobs to be done at Richborough. Now, this is a tricky part of Richborough because during the excavations, they found 56,000 coins, which were listed in the 1980s properly by Richard Rees, a well-known coin expert. 22,000 of these came from the final 14 years of the site, what he calls his Rees period 21. But actually, the majority of these come from 388 to 392-95, and after that, it really drops off. And what this represents, we don't really know. The idea of lots of hoards has been suggested, but there are some hoards, but lots of the coinage is just spread out everywhere, and it doesn't look like dispersed hoards. It could be one last lot of military pay being dumped onto the site that never made its way inland, because at that point, people wanted the silver and gold coins. No one was using the bronze. And even if you had bronze coins, it was a good few thousand to make up the value of one gold coin. But these coins have caused a bit of a headache. These graphs are usually quite difficult to interpret, but what you need to know about them is that the numbers along the middle represent the different Rees periods, 21 being the one I just showed. And the line across the middle with these represents the British average, so the average number of coins on a site at this time. And as you add these up, you get what we call the cumulative frequency of these coins over time until you reach a total point again. Now, as you can see, the lines are very different. Richborough causes a major problem where, because there are 22,000 at the very end, it skews the entire line. When the line is going down, it suggests coins are being added at a slower rate than the British average. And when they're going up, it's a faster rate. And as you can see, Richborough is adding coins at a slower rate all the way through the Roman period until the very end. So we need to correct for this. And to do that, I found the average number of coins from this period from other similar sites and calculated what the real percentage would be. And what it does is it gives a better picture. But another problem is here. At one point, period 13, this is around the Gallic Empire and Carausius, the usurpers in Britain, one calculation makes it go down and one calculation makes it go up. And this is because all the unidentifiable coinage from the late 3rd century was put into one period 14, which isn't really a good idea because it makes the numbers very similar and gives a skewed picture. So this will be in my PhD and part of my research, but I've come up with some calculations that recalculate and reinterpret Richborough. And what this does is this actually makes it look more like a late Roman shore fort pattern. Almost lastly here, Roman recycling has been a big part of my study, and about nearly 20 years ago, more than 16 years ago now, Justine Bailey and Sonia Butcher looked at the typology and the metal analysis of the brooches from the site and determined that in the 4th century there was a lot of recycling going on. They're not good brass or bronze brooches. They are leaded leaded bronze, leaded brass, gunmetal, being a mix of different metals in there. And I've done the same with the late Roman belt fittings and found exactly the same pattern, that they're being made from recycled materials. And it goes to show that there is a lack of new metal, a lack of new objects coming in from the continent at this stage. Going back to those gaming boards, the gaming board showed recycling from the monumental marble, but there is a lot of Samian pottery made into gaming counters. But again, interpretation is a big thing here, and there needs to be, and there are ongoing wider studies into these, because some of these are quite large, and where they've been interpreted as gaming counters, they might actually be makeshift bottle stoppers. So there needs to be, again, like everything at Richborough, so much more work done. And finally, on the recycling side, there are a couple of buckles which I pulled out, which are identified as horse girth buckles, so for horse tack and for keeping the saddle and rider in place. But these two, as you can see, the ends have been bent over and the corners seem to have been bent round. And that's because they've been recycled from late Roman bracelets. I talked to a few people about these and who ride horses, and they say, I mean, they'd work, but given that they were recycled from other metal and bent, no, they probably wouldn't have lasted very long. They might have come off quite quickly. These two have somehow survived quite well. And then in the very late period, we find evidence of Christianity of the site, and this is probably not until the 380s AD, from the stratigraphy and what it now shows. Here we've got a Roman helmet fitting with a Cairo clearly on the front, a sign of Christ, and then a disc of Maxentius, so mid 4th century, but it could even be Constantine III. It could be any emperor from the 350s to the early 400s. And to finally actually finish off, Richborough isn't all about the objects and the site, it's about, well, the people who dug there. Here in the flat cap, we have J.P. Bush-Fox, who led the excavations on the site, and also the beard, we have Thomas May, who was a pottery specialist at the time and did a lot of work identifying lots of new forms that came out from Richborough. And then there are all of the workers that excavated the site. They were miners. Bush-Fox used miners for many of his excavations for his whole career, and they were usually paid by the type of objects they found. So there was probably an incentive to find gold and silver coins. And I should also mention at this stage, Eileen Fox, Lady Fox as she was, who excavated there as a student, set up the first museum, and did a lot of the finds reports for the publications, who does not get enough credit for the work she put in there. Like Cleopatra doesn't get the right mentions, and she's left out of a lot of the reports sometimes. But as I say, much more study is needed. So finding a colorized photo of the site hut at the time with all the pottery laid out, you can see there's a huge amount there of even complete vessels to be studied. So if anyone is interested in pottery, it's ripe for the picking, really. And as I said, I did mention a new chronology for the site at the beginning. It's really complex to go into, and I've only just finished writing the paper, which I'm intending to send off for publication very shortly. But what I will do is, while there are questions, I will leave it up on the screen for people to look at who are in the know about the site and might at some point want to challenge me on it. Yeah, thanks very much.